So, good morning. Tuesday morning, very easy session from PowerShell one-liners to functions and then to modules. Just a quick question before we start. Who has written modules already in PowerShell? So why are you here? Yeah, okay. Okay, let's see if we find something interesting for you as well. The ones who haven't written modules yet, have you written functions so far in PowerShell? Okay, okay, good. So let's start. Yeah, first of all, thanks to the organizer. It's always great if Gail takes the courage to organize events like this and even more the PowerShell conference in Antwerp this year, sorry. My name is Raimund. I'm a former PFE, then we have been renamed to customer engineers, then to cloud solution architects. Who knows what the next job title will be, but the job hasn't changed in almost 20 years. So I'm still doing most of my day something around PowerShell, DSC, DevOps, automation. And my main projects, which are published on GitHub, are Automated Lab, if you want to install a lab environment on Azure or on Hyper-V with less effort, and the DSC workshop and the Microsoft 365 DSC workshop, which brings the learning of 20 years of DSC history together. So, starts very well. Here we go. This is about doing programming right. And what is programming? Technical expertise and coding mindset. Sometimes people don't have the technical expertise. You realize this if, for example, authentication is done in a really interesting way, or if Active Directory or Azure AD is bombarded with requests, even if you have all the data on the machine already. And other people don't have the coding mindset. So they want to automate something, they have the technical expertise, but it looks pretty awkward and even doesn't sometimes work as expected. So, of course, the best combination is to have both. And if we have both, then we have these three goals that we want to solve. Of course, a specific problem to kind of automate the business requirement. Then our code should be easy to read. Sometimes it's not. Will you share your presentation after this? You can have the presentation, but you can also take pictures if you want to. Yeah. And then the code should be maintainable and, of course, executable. And maintainable sometimes is an issue. And let's see why. Where are we coming from? Do you remember still this guy here? Yes. Yeah, this is the good old days. I'm not even sure when it was invented, but the scripting guy were very popular in the beginning of the 2000 years. So 2002, 3, 4, 5, when Visual Basic was very, very popular, not because it was so good, but because it was the only language available, right? At the Microsoft platform, we had the command shell, which was pretty bad. And then as an alternative, Visual Basic, which was also very bad, but better than nothing. And then PowerShell came along, and with PowerShell 1.0, we didn't have even an integrated scripting environment, nothing. So with PowerShell 2, we came up with the ISE. The ISE was also not the best product, so other companies felt encouraged to build something like Quest, built the PowerShell or the Power GUI, which was way better that day than the ISE. And then PowerShell got a bit more mature. So then came Pesto along and the PS Script Analyzer and a bunch of modules which usually have been driven by the community. So the PowerShell ecosystem was kind of kicked off by Microsoft, but the success is not because of Microsoft, but rather because of the community, right? The community grew very, very quickly. And in 2017, 18, the DSC community was established because DSC was pretty popular at that time, and mainly then driven by the company logo, Synergy, Gail's company, who kind of tried to organize the stuff and tried to impose rules, patterns, and best practices onto this community. And this was, in my opinion, the best approach and the most successful approach I've ever seen to organize something in a way that every project looked the same, right? And we will have a look at this product in a minute. Yeah, and Azure pipelines to build and test code automatically. So this is just the kind of evolution that we have seen in the PowerShell community scope from my perspective. Yeah, we are coming from VBS. And sometimes you still see scripts that are having similarities to Visual Basic Script and do not use the best practices that we have, and sometimes even not the language features that we have. So why do we need guidelines and rules? And last year we did a tour through the Altai Mountains, and what are you missing here in this picture? Streets, street signs, no guidelines, right? You can do whatever you want. But you can do this because you're traveling pretty much alone. There is nobody else. So everything or all you can harm is yourself. If you are in some German or Swiss or Austrian city, it usually looks like this, right? Because a bunch of people, or millions of people need to organize or need to get organized, and we need to find a way to get along and not injure each other. So this is why we need rules, of course. And we have the same rules and the same principles in every kind of coding environment, because if we are coding by our own, then it's not very important how the code looks like and how understandable it is. But as soon as you hand it over to your colleague, and sometimes your colleague is yourself, right? Because you're handing over to yourself, but 2 years later, and then you look at the code and you think, oh, what have I done here? What have I even tried, right? And this is why guidelines and some certain principles and patterns are always important. And coding best practices, I think there are more than that, but these are the ones that came to my mind, right? Portability, automated testing, something that is even more important than you think. Camel case or Pascal case. So be organized when naming variables, functions, because it makes it easier in your day-to-day life. I've seen one interesting meme here that I want to show. I haven't put it into the slides. No, PSD UK. Let's see if I find it. Yeah, here. Yeah, I think everybody has experienced that, right? It's a very nasty and stupid typo, because your script is maybe not following a certain pattern, and the pattern would have saved you from that, right? So always be very precise if it comes to variable naming. Yeah, something that is also very important, especially if it comes to PowerShell, build modular code, which is very easy in PowerShell. We have so many good structures and language features to do that. And with modularity comes rich data structures, right? So don't return just a string or return an integer, return something with meaning. And we will see in a minute how that works. Of course, reusability, scalability, and I need to emphasize this again, because many people think that style and indentation is not important. It is, right? Especially if you work in a community project, because then you maybe change 2 or 3 lines and you press Alt, Shift, F for doing an automatic formatting. And then all the code just gets reformatted, and then you lose your actual change, right? Because you want to then commit this single change, the 1 or 2 lines that you have changed, back into the Git repository. But because of the formatting, everything changes. So it's important that we work all with the same formatting, because otherwise formatting is kind of hiding the intention that you have, the real change. Good, so these are the things that we should adhere. And these are the things that PowerShell and the PowerShell ecosystem comes with, right? We need to do things like, of course, proper flow control. Have you ever heard about the cyclomatic complexity, the term? It's mostly known in programming, and it means how many layers of code do you have? How many layers of if statements? How many layers of for each statements? And sometimes you see code that has 5, 6, 7 layers of if statements that can be reduced to 2 or 3 layers if you do it the right way, right? So also use these structures in an appropriate way. If it comes to functions, I like to speak about the inside view of code and the outside view. So the inside architecture is pretty much up to you. You define how your function looks like and how it works, but it's not so important for the end user how your script looks internally. Very important is the outside view, and I think this is even more important than the inside view. And the outside view is parameters. What else do we have? Modules, functions and pipeline support, comment-based help, and that's it. And support should process. right? So this is how you present your code, your function to the end user. And if this is bad, then we don't even need to look at your code inside, because then what you have created is pretty much unusable, or not unusable, but hard to use, right? This is why I always emphasize people and encourage people to look at the definition and the design of the function from the outside view in terms of parameters and what it returns. This is the most important thing. And if you have done this right, then we should think about, does the code adhere to standards via script analyzer? Do we return rich objects, custom objects, right? In PowerShell, it's very easy to not return only the essence of the function, but also some metadata to give it some context. Pester. Who is using Pester? Some of them. Good. Are you using Pester for everything, or how do you estimate when it is useful to test your code? What are the rules here? Just interesting, because I find it very hard to write tests, and sometimes if you think tests are important for a certain function, you end up with testing or test code that is 3, 4, 5 times more lines than the actual code that you want to test. And then sometimes you feel that there is a break even when testing doesn't add much value to your project, but just costs an immense amount of time, right? So yeah. Good. Another very important thing, it doesn't have to do with language features, but is Git. Still, I see people starting a project without a code repository in the background. And then you usually use track about your changes, you have no kind of versioning, branching. So even if you start something and you think it might just take 1 or 2 days to create the software, and it will just migrate something and then be removed anyway, start with a Git repository, because this gives you the safety that you always can go back if something doesn't work as expected. Good. So let's have a look at how these things work. But I think there is one thing I want to emphasize. Regular expressions. Everybody hates them. Not me, I love them. It's a very great piece of technology built in, as far as I remember, in the 70s. And it got pretty popular, even in the Microsoft world, not very long ago, right? So maybe 2010, 2012 got popular. So it's very, very interesting to have a technology in the IT built 30, 40 years ago, which is still up to date and still does its job. Yeah. So regular expression, there is some interesting statement here, and the other one is classes. Who has used classes in PowerShell? What for? Why? Please tell me, what is the purpose of classes in PowerShell? Pardon, too? Okay, but when do you need them? Never? It depends. Okay, yeah. That might be a reason, yeah. Anything else? Depends on your code definition, how you define the classes. Yeah, but you can trust them more than, yeah.
Because a function is unpredictable.
Yeah. Well, if you have pester tests that are proving that your function is predictable, then you don't need classes then, right? Yeah. So what I want to say is, classes have been invented not because of a replacement of functions. I mean, in C#, without classes, you can't do anything, right? In Java, the same thing. These are object-oriented languages for a reason. PowerShell is a kind of functional language. Everything is based on commandlets and functions. And I would never leave this pattern, because functions are what your end user are expecting and what everybody can invoke. You don't need to be an expert to invoke a PowerShell function, because it behaves the same like a commandlet. And a commandlet behaves almost the same like an executable, right? And almost everybody is be able to do a ping. So everybody is then be able to invoke a commandlet. Classes have been invented to make contracts between different developers and departments. What you guys said, right? You want to have some trust on whatever is returned. And to make sure that the structure that comes back always is expected or always is matching an expected pattern, we can define classes. But sometimes you see people trying to replace commandlets and functions with classes, or they build a backend and want to kind of do everything in classes, and this doesn't end up. And I found an interesting statement regarding classes as well. But first of all, some people, when confronted with the problem, think, I'll use regular expressions. Now they have two problems. And I have this experience a couple of times. You think that regular expressions are a powerful tool to solve also non-string related issues, and then you end up with something that is way more complex than the initial problem is. So be careful what kind of pattern and technology you use for what kind of purpose. And the other one is, using PowerShell classes the wrong way may result in kind of problem factory, right? Factory pattern, object orientation, and this results in a problem factory. Yeah, I've seen two large customers who kind of created a whole backend just based on classes, and it was very hard to debug, especially as classes in PowerShell are not like in C#. They are not just available. It was very important what kind of file you load first to have the types available, and this imposes a lot of strange issues, and this is why I would not use classes just because I think they might be better. There must be a reason for that. Good. Let's start into demos, and what I'm doing here is I'm recycling something that I have created 2 years ago, and with this I have recycled something that a colleague thought might be quite helpful. And it is this one here. So the link is then also in the slides. It's just github.com, my alias, and then PowerShell training. And I have given a couple of PowerShell trainings, but what was missing in all these trainings is something to take at home afterwards, right? You learn a couple of language features, but at the end you have no clue how do these language features fit together. And what we want to do here is we want to go from a one-liner to a full-featured advanced function. Then we want to extend this function with parameter sets. Why are these things important? Then we are converting this into a simple module, and then we are extending the module with helper functions, nested modules, and so on. And this is not complete. So 2 weeks ago, I was giving a training in DSC, and it turned out that it could be quite interesting to then convert this PowerShell module into a DSC resource to have this idiom potency. This is something that I will add in the next couple of days. And if we start here with this one, then there is a bit of text. I think we don't have the time to run through the whole thing, but let's get started. And let's say we want to have a function that finds small files. Very precise requirement. Then of course we start with that, and then we want to calculate how big the files are, right? And I think as you have all written functions and modules yet, it should be very easy to follow. And then we want to get finally to the filtering, where we want to have only the files that are, in our opinion, small. Let's say everything below 100K is considered small, and we have then this kind of statement. And if we want to convert this to a function, pretty easy. This is how it looks like, right? So this could be a function that a PowerShell beginner writes. And then the question is, if I write a function, what else would you add to the function to make it of real value, to make it flexible, reusable, and extensible? And of course, what we always want to have are parameters. And so often you see people writing code having 1, 2, 3 parameters, but then another 1, 2, 3 settings hard-coded into the script. Why, right? Even if you need a default value, make it a parameter and assign a default value, but do not use hard-coded variables. And if you have to, there was something written here. No. One important language feature or requirement is configuration. You can put configuration data into a PowerShell module file, the PSD1 file, right? You can access from within the module the PSD1 file and use the PSD1 file as a kind of repository for configuration data. It's not recommended, but it works, right? Then we have the configuration module. It's a PowerShell module widely used to store configuration, and I guess you've heard the name Fred Weinmann. He's also pretty popular in the PowerShell community, and one of his modules is the PS framework. And the PS framework comes with two major features. One is logging. So it's the most developed logging that I've ever seen. You can log into, by default, into the event log, onto the text, into memory, SQL Server, Splunk, so a couple of providers, and it's extensible, so you can write your own providers to log wherever you want to. And the other feature is configuration data. And you can create configuration data that is kind of bound to a module, and then for the user or the computer scope, right? So if you want to deal with configuration data and logging, have a look at PS Framework. PS Framework, I think his website is, here it is. So if you need logging or configuration management, have a look at that. That's the best I've seen so far. Good, back to this one. So always define parameters, and parameters in a parameter block, be as precise as possible. So a parameter should not just have a name, it should have, if required, I have two parameters, wait a minute, yeah, it should have definitely a type, right? Even if you don't know what type it is, then you should indicate the object type, just to make sure, or just to tell people that we are not really sure what kind of type we're accepting here. But be very precise usually about the type you are accepting. Then what is always important is make parameters mandatory, right? So is this script working at all if the length or the max size is not specified? No, because, right, if the length is used here as a filter criteria. So make it mandatory. Pretty easy to do. Here we go. At the beginning of my PowerShell development, some time back, I did not do this all the time because I was not very accustomed to these curly brackets and square brackets and try to avoid all these kinds of brackets where I could. But over time, you get, of course, used to it. Otherwise, without the square curly brackets, we can't even define a hash table. So at the beginning, sometimes you may think the syntax is not very user-friendly, but if you have done this a couple of hundred times, then it's just, off the cuff doable. Okay, and then the next thing that we want to do is, of course, if we have defined the parameters like we need it, here a mandatory one and here one with a default value, the next thing is we need to do some basic validation. And validation could look like this, right? So we don't have a standard validator for the path, so this is why we can use validate script and test if the path is available. And the other one is just a validation of the range. So we should have at least a value larger than 1 or larger equals to 1 and not larger than the max value of long. By the way, you can create your own validators. What is the name of this construct in the object-oriented world in Java, C#? Yeah, there is something more. So in PowerShell, we are calling these decorators, but it's not a decorator, right? A decorator is something that looks nice, but doesn't have a real value or a real functionality. This is an attribute, and with the attribute, you are describing the next object in line. And these attributes can be also created by yourself. If you are creating, or if you're defining a class, and the class inherits from attributes. And then you can create your own validators. You can create a lot of things that you can attach to an object, and then you can ask the objects or can query the object's attribute, and based on that, you can do further decisions or further activities, right? So this is nothing that is only available to PowerShell internally. Also, you can make use of these attributes. And maybe I will put some links into the presentation that I will upload on GitHub later about how to do that. But this is then definitely more advanced stuff. Okay, good. So now we have a function that is taking a path, that is taking a max size value. Parameters look very nice. So everyone who is looking up this function should intuitively understand how things work. And then we have our simple command here. By looking at the function, sometimes people ask, wait a minute, we have only one line of code, so is it worth to write a function at all? when is it, or how many lines of code do you need to encapsulate to make it worth writing a function?
So we lost creating a function because you can reuse it.
You can reuse it, yeah? Somebody said 1. Why?
Because in the complicated project that you want to
Right.
set and express your meaning.
Yeah. There is one interesting function in, it's a method actually, but also a function, date time is leap year 2000. Okay. 2000 obviously was a leap year. So do you remember the calculation behind that function? We all had it, I think, at middle school or something, right? How you can calculate a leap year. But if you just see the formula to do that, it won't tell you what's going on, right? So this is why we are giving this complexity of calculating a leap year a name, and the name is understandable for everybody. And then you don't even care about the complexity in the back end, because all you need to understand is the name, the method, and what it returns, right? So even if you have just one line, it may be worth of creating a method or a function. And looking at that, could we extend this function to make it more valuable? What jumps to your mind if you want to make this a bit more generic, more helpful?
Return the file names.
Pardon?
You can return the file names.
We can return the file names. Yeah, maybe. So give it a context, right? At the moment, we are just returning, we are returning the file names. No, we don't, sorry, yeah. We're returning just a measure info object, and that contains the number, the count of files that we have found and the size. Okay, returning the file names can be helpful, maybe not, depends on how many things you get back, yeah, but it's an idea. Anything else? Why not? Yes, pardon? What is about the max size?
Like, you define a small file as 100 kilobytes, maybe for me it's 100 megabytes.
Good. The context, right? So you're returning a bunch of files that are considered to be small. So you think they are small. Then you're storing this somewhere in a file, and your colleague thinks, why this file, right? What was the reason why we put this file into the collection? So give it a context. Put this number into your output. Exactly. But first, I would go into supporting array values, right? So at the moment, we are only be able to get the small files of one particular folder, and we know that PowerShell likes the pipeline. The pipeline always involves arrays, collections of objects. So the first thing I would do is, or not maybe the first, but one thing I would do is make the path an array parameter. And then magically things don't work anymore, because let's see what this does. New file. I hope the font is okay. And I've heard that from a distance, it's always better to have it like this. Is it better than black? Okay. And if we call that, then here we go. We have 20 files in our Windows directory. Okay. Let's do it like this: Windows, comma, and we've seen that also this could be quite nice, right? So we are passing the path to resolve path first to support wildcards. Quite nice. And then let's have a look in the lab sources software packages. Okay. So now we have 22 files, and we are back to the same problem, right? Give information context. Which of these files are in Windows and which ones are in software packages? We have no clue, right? So this is not really adding value, it just blurs the context. Okay, and this is why, first of all, we want to call our actual code as often, or as many times as we have given folders, right? So we put this into a for each loop, and then we are getting 2 objects back. And at least now we need to give the context, right? Because now we are missing some important data, and this comes to creating custom objects. Who of you is familiar with a PS custom object? statement, right? Yeah. This is one of the most helpful and the most important things in PowerShell, because now it's completely in your control how the return value should look like, right? You can do whatever you want, and of course here we can also reach out to other functions to make it a little bit more flexible. And even if you have created your object, because this is just a pretty flexible object type, you can add properties, you can remove them. So creating the object doesn't mean it's written in stone. You can change it afterwards, and you can even give the object a name. And if you give the object a name, that can be quite helpful if you want to have a formatter, right? The PS1 XML files to present them in a nice fashion and not just with the PowerShell standard formatters. So this is the way we want to go, and we do this by walking over our paths that we have been given. We are storing our results in a variable, and then here comes the context, right? So we are creating a custom PS custom object that stores the current path, the max size, so that we agree on the max size value, then the total file size sum, and the count. And if we call that, oh, we have the copy button, much easier. Then here we go. Now we have two objects, and we know exactly how many small files we have in Windows and Windows System 32, what is small, and how many are there in terms of size and count, right? The interesting thing here is sometimes people then argue, yeah, but it's much of effort just to get this job done, right? But if you code often enough, then writing a function like this takes you maybe 5 minutes. And if you are already in the context of writing this function, adding a little bit more to the function is taking you maybe 1 or 2 minutes more. If the requirement comes back to you after you have released the function and maybe have mentally disconnected yourself from the code because the job is done, and then someone asks to add something to the function, then it, of course, it's much more load, more cognitive load and more coding load. So always try to make a function as generic as possible while you're writing it, because then you are in the flow and it is much easier for you. Okay, any questions so far? Does this code looks okay, looks familiar?
You just maybe use like add member. You have to do like a bunch of piping, right? So you would just make the add member and then add like the size and the path.
Yeah, you can add member can be done as well. It's usually a bit slower. So I always prefer PS custom objects because this statement here is much slower than using the pipeline and then adding something to already created objects. But add member definitely has its advantages because you can add script properties, right? And a script property then is calculated when you access it, and you don't have to assign. Are you familiar with add member? Yeah. So what we could do is put this into O, and then you do O pipe add member name. What could be interesting here? Size, file size, sum. Oh, look at that. Nice. This is Copilot helping me to write what Copilot thinks is what my intent is. Okay, let's see. So we have a value of this. Yeah, it's not bad. Okay. And so what we're doing is we are adding a file size sum in kilobytes, and we are adding it as a script property. Script means we have to provide a script block, and the script block is only invoked when I access the file size sum kilobyte property. So, and if we run the function, and first of all we need to return O, and we need to put it into some variable like result. Okay, $result, pipe get member. And here we go. We have now our object with the node properties. This is the standard PS custom object thing, right? Plus a script property that invokes the script block that is hidden in here when accessing it. And this is how it looks like. Result 0, here we go. And there we see sum in kilobytes calculated already and nicely formatted, right? So add member is a good hint. It can make your objects even more flexible and the context more usable, right? So these options. Of course, we could also have not use this one, but rather do a file. Right, this would have worked the same. No. So it's either a value or either you attach a script block, and then if you access the property, then the script block invokes and takes this as the input parameter, or you are calculating the string when creating the object. So it's totally up to you. This is usually faster, but it depends on how many objects you have. If you have just 10 objects to return, there is no difference in performance. If you have 1 million objects to return, then I would not use this because it's much slower than creating the PS custom object right away. Good. So, pipeline support. Who has written functions that are supporting the pipeline? Not so many, yeah. And I always encourage people to do this, and I need to encourage myself as well, because if you start writing a function, you usually do not think about the pipeline. And then you realize that the function that you have created is maybe a bit more important. For example, in automated lab, we have a function to start the VM. One of start, stop, restart, wait for a VM. So very fundamental functions. And these functions do not support the pipeline. Why? Because we have forgotten it to put it in at the very beginning, and then you're too lazy and you will never add the feature after the function is released and used in multiple projects. And it would be so nice to be able to do get lab VM, pipe, start lab VM, but it doesn't work. So we have to do a dollar variable or dollar VMs equals get lab VM and then start lab VM and pass them as a variable, right? So just because we have been too lazy to implement this right away. And implementing a pipeline support in PowerShell is extremely easy. The only thing you have to do is tell one parameter to accept values from the pipeline. And how many parameters do you think can accept values from the pipeline? Actually, all of them, but then all get the same value, right? Because there is only one object being passed over the pipeline or through the pipeline. And logically, it makes sense to only assign this to one single parameter. There is also value from pipeline by property name, and then you can have multiple parameters accepting values from the pipeline, and the PowerShell then maps the object properties to the parameters. But this is a different story. So simple pipeline support needs one parameter accepting value from the pipeline, and we need the begin, the process, and the end block. If we do not specify them, then we are in the end block by default, which means your function will only see the last element of the pipeline, which is pretty much not what you want. And our function being extended to pipeline support is this one. Right, now we have a parameter block that pretty much looks the same, except value from pipeline is here. And then we have a process block. Process means do this for every object that we are passing along the pipeline. Okay, so why do we still need to have the for each loop if the process block is a for each loop anyway? No. As a parameter, you mean? Yes. So this is the pattern that you want to use if your function should support, and here it is. No, it's not. If your function should use should support pipeline, right? We are getting some items and then we are piping them to get small file. But on the other hand, we may want to still be able to call get file and pass the elements as a normal parameter value, right? So if you want to do or have both patterns supported, then we have our process block the process block runs once for each object coming over the pipeline. But if we are using the old way of using parameters, then the process block has only one object to run over, the parameter object, but the parameter might have multiple values inside. And then we are running over the objects within the array. So let's do a short demo on that. And first of all, we need to copy it. And I think the best way to demonstrate or to understand code and demonstrate the code flow is using breakpoints and the debugger, right? Because then you can really visualize how your code behaves. And if we do a breakpoint right here, and we are using the pipeline, then what we see is that as soon as we jump into the process block, I don't want to have this menu. Dollar, what is it? Dollar path. And what we see is we have passed in 2 paths. So 2 objects have been passed to the function, but the function inside the process block sees only the first value. So it doesn't even know about a second value, right? So we have 1 value. So the for each loop has nothing to do. It's just 1 value, right? So we have now a 1-time iteration here, but we have a 2-time iteration of the process block, right? 2 objects coming through the pipeline to the object, meaning the process block is invoked twice, and the for each block is just invoked once. Process block, and now the path is program files. So we're doing an iteration over program files, only 1 object, and that's it. If we do the same thing again with the parameter, okay, then the process block is only invoked once because the path contains both elements. And now we have the for each loop, which is required to run over both elements. Testing the path first. Come on, and now running over the first one, creating the output, and now running over the second one, right? So this pattern is the best approach if you want to have a function that is supporting both styles, assigning values using parameters and assigning values over the pipeline. And if you have done this a number of times, then it's just a very easy thing to do, not very special or demanding anymore in terms of coding perspective. Does this raise questions? And unfortunately, there are so many commandlets, even written by Microsoft, that do not follow this pattern. There are so many commandlets that either only support parameters or only support the pipeline, and that's why, right? PowerShell could be so comfortable, but of course, people need to have a common understanding, and this is why patterns are so important, right? If you have your list of patterns in your head that you want to realize when creating a new function, and you just have a kind of lists, and you mark, you check each pattern in the list, then the function at the end will be reliable, will be comfortable, will be easy to understand, will be easy to maintain. And if you have seen the pattern not just once, but 100 times, then of course also debugging is much easier because you know what's going on, right? If you have a different pattern or no pattern at all, like different coding styles for every kind of software that you do, then of course also debugging and understanding is much more complex. Good. This is get small file. Then what we could do now, having this kind of pipeline support, is doing something before starting the pipeline and something that goes after the pipeline. And to summarize this, and then we are almost done. Here we go. So now we have added some help which usually does not happen, unfortunately. Help is still an issue. But we have our path, our max file size, and a switch parameter for adding a summary. And if we want to have a summary available, then at the end of our procedure, we are returning the summary object. And the summary object is being created before the actual processing. It's just another PS custom object. And the PS custom object is filled with a value in the process block. Right? Here we go. And at the end, we're returning it, which means if we are calling this function another time, but with add summary, we don't need that. Okay, here we go. We have our information about small files in Windows. We have the same for program files, and we have the summary. Okay, program files wasn't very helpful. If we get to the lab source software packages one more time, here we go. 220 makes it 22, right? Quite nice. And as soon as you remove the add summary switch, because for some reason it's not important, then of course this will not be created and is no longer disturbing in case you don't need it. Yeah, so that's the full-blown function. It started with just a dir and a combination of dir and where object, and now we have something that is even for a non-PowerShell expert very easy to use. And it gives you information context, plus it supports pipelining as well as invoking it with parameters. Does it make sense? Before finishing, because I'm still already running too slow, if the requirement comes along that we not only want to have small files, but also large files, what would you do? How would you try to also put the requirement of getting large files into PowerShell code? What would be the workflow? Well, some people would say, okay, let's create another function, a get large file function. So next week, your manager comes along and says, we need old files. Okay, then let's get old file function, right? And at the end, you have a library of just functions for finding specific types of files. So what would be the better way of dealing with the requirement of finding various file categories? Even more generic. And this is key, right? Making a function generic. Don't think about the specific use case, just think broad. And this would lead us to, but I think we don't have time to do this at the moment, but it's available on GitHub if you are interested in looking at this. We want to have a max file size and a min size parameter. But thinking about min and max size, what's now the problem if we are just extending our function to have both parameters? Conflicts, right. How do we, because maybe our user doesn't understand the function as we do, doesn't understand our design, and defines the max size and the min size. How do we solve that? How can we make a function that is only giving us access to one of the properties, parameters? Parameter sets, right. And with parameter sets, you can make a parameter mutually exclusive, right? And here we go. So one parameter is in max size, the other one is in parameter set min size. Parameters can also belong to many parameter sets. So for example, you could have another parameter that is available in min size as optional and mandatory in max size, right? So there are all kinds of various combinations. Parameter sets are very powerful if you want to make your function more generic. And if the user still doesn't understand how things work and tries to define both parameters, then you get this error message, because then PowerShell doesn't know what do you actually want, right? You need to make a decision between parameter set A and B. And then finally, the only thing we need to do is ask our commandlet, in which parameter set do you think we are? And depending on the parameter set of the current invocation, we can either use the less equals operator with the max size or the greater equals operator with the min size. And then we have both use cases in just one function. The only thing left to do is rename the function, because It's no longer just for getting small files, it would be just get file, right? Yeah, and of course, we want to convert this into, why would we want to convert this function into a module? What are the reasons to have something available as part of the module and not as a standalone function? I can also share a function. Pardon? Autoloaded, yeah, that's a good thing. Some people don't like autoloading, some do, yeah. I like it. What else? And this autoloading thing is auto-discoverability, right? You just install the module and you don't need to even know where it is. It's just there, right? So modules are the key to make your functions easy accessible and yeah, just easy installable, because usually things are either available on the PS Gallery or on your internal NuGet repository, right? So you have a common way of sharing the code. So, and converting something into a module is extremely easy, described here as well. Is it? No, that's the wrong one. All right, so this text then leads us through how to create the module as well as a module manifest file, and that's it. Final words. Back to the slides. Here's the link to the material that I've just shown. Have a look, please, at the unofficial PowerShell best practice and style guidelines. Style is important, right? And this is, I think, the best repository that explains you why it is important and what are the best practices if it comes to writing PowerShell code. Naming convention, reusable tools, output and formatting. So this is a very good repository. Another one is the DSC community. It also comes with style guidelines. And if you want to write modules the right way, then I would definitely emphasize and recommend the sampler module from Gale, because this module is, yeah, how can you put this? It forces you to write high quality code at the very beginning, because your code is then built and tested and also linted. Linting is the process of making sure the code adheres to coding standards in a release pipeline or in a build script, right? In a build script, and this can be run in a release pipeline. And therefore, even if you write as a very small function, this function is just tested against all the best practices that we have. So you can't even release bad code because of all the tests, right? So if you want to write professional modules, this is the way to go. It gives you access, or it forces you to apply all the best practices that we have in the PowerShell field. Good. That's it. Actually, I'm sorry for talking longer than expected. Any questions so far? There are a lot of things that we haven't discussed, like splatting, right? Like, yeah, many other things. If there are no questions, I have one. What is PowerShell? Is it a very simple or very complex language? What do you think? But from a linguistic point of view, is PowerShell simple or complex? No. Very complex, yeah. This was actually a question raised, I think, 2-3 years ago at the PowerShell conference by Bruce Payette. He has written the PowerShell parser, and he said, look at how many different combinations of brackets we have in PowerShell, right? So what is actually the most simple language that we know of in the IT? The most simple language? Assembler, right? Assembler can just push memory addresses around. That's the most simple language, but you won't be able to accomplish anything in assembler because it's very demanding for the developer, right? PowerShell is the most complex language, or one of the most complex languages that we have, but this makes it easy for us. The only thing you need to learn is about all the language features and why we are calling it a complex language, right? And then this complexity is for making your life easier. Good. 9:58. I think it's time for another coffee break. or a late breakfast.